new Maritime Incident File has surfaced. If you appreciate these types of mermaid stories, take a short break to like and subscribe. Either way, enjoy.
The photograph was still clutched in his hand when Senior Chief Harrigan found him. 17 hours of silence from a United States Navy research submarine, and this was what waited in the torpedo room of the USS Nereid. A single crew member, alive but unresponsive, his diving suit torn at the shoulders, his fingernails cracked and bleeding as if he had tried to claw his way through solid steel, his eyes fixed on something none of them could see. Chief Petty Officer William Kowalski would not release that photograph for another 6 hours, and when medical personnel finally pried it from his grip, what it depicted would never appear in any official report. The image showed the Nereid's forward observation window at a depth of 412 feet. Something was pressed against the glass from the outside. Something with a face that was almost human. Something that was smiling. But to understand what Senior Chief Thomas Harrigan and his dive team discovered that morning in the cold waters of Puget Sound, and to understand why the United States Navy would later classify this incident under protocols reserved for matters of national security, we need to go back to the evening before, when Coast Guard Station Port Angeles received a call that made no sense at all. The night of October 14, 2015, began with paperwork and cold coffee. Senior Chief Petty Officer Thomas Harrigan had spent 23 years with the United States Coast Guard, the last 8 of them running dive operations out of Station Port Angeles on the northern edge of Washington's Olympic Peninsula. In that time, he had conducted over 300 recovery operations in waters that ranged from the relatively calm passages of Puget Sound to the brutal swells of the open Pacific beyond Cape Flattery. He had pulled bodies from capsized fishing vessels, retrieved wreckage from depths that would crush an unprotected human in seconds, and seen enough of what the ocean could do to a man that he no longer dreamed about the sea. The water had taken something from him over those 23 years. Some capacity for surprise that other men still possessed, and in its place had left a cold pragmatism that served him well in moments of crisis. He was 51 years old, 6 months from mandatory retirement review, and he had never once filed an incomplete incident report. That record, maintained across more than 2 decades of service, would end on October 15th. The call came through at 2,247 hours. Routed from Coast Guard Sector Puget Sound, with a priority designation that Harrigan had only seen twice before in his entire career. Both previous instances had involved mass casualty events requiring immediate multi-agency response, and the sight of that designation on his communication terminal made him set down his pen and give the message his full attention. A United States Navy research submarine, the USS Nereid, had surfaced unexpectedly in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, approximately 9 nautical miles north of Port Angeles. The vessel was not responding to radio contact on any frequency. No distress beacon had been activated despite the vessel's apparent emergency ascent. The submarine had simply risen from a depth of 400 feet, breached the surface at an angle that suggested emergency ballast release, and gone completely silent. Harrigan remembered reading the message twice, then a third time, because none of the details followed any protocol he had ever learned. Navy submarines did not surface without establishing communication with their command structure. They did not drift in shipping lanes without activating the emergency beacons that would alert maritime traffic to their presence. And they certainly did not require Coast Guard assistance for recovery operations within sight of a naval installation at Bangor, where submarine support crews maintained constant readiness. Yet the request was explicit and carried authorization codes that Harrigan recognized as genuine. Coast Guard dive team required for immediate vessel boarding and crew assessment. Navy support vessels en route from Bangor, but delayed by weather conditions in the strait. Estimated arrival of naval assets, 6 hours minimum. In the margin of the message, handwritten in a way that suggested it had been added after the official transmission, were 3 words that made Harrigan's instincts prickle with unease. Exercise extreme caution. He had turned to his team, and told them to gear up for a boarding operation. He did not tell them about the knot forming in his stomach, or the fact that in 23 years of service, he had never once been asked to board a Navy vessel without a naval escort present. Some details he had learned through hard experience were better left unspoken until they became relevant. The team assembled within 20 minutes, gathering their equipment with the efficient silence of men who had worked together long enough to anticipate each other's needs. Petty Officer First Class Daniel Oshoa handled communications and surface support, a quiet man from Tucson who had joined the Coast Guard because he wanted to see the ocean and discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred to experience it from the deck of a ship rather than beneath its surface. Oshoa was 43 years old, methodical in his approach to every task, and possessed of a memory for radio frequencies and communication protocols that had proven invaluable on more than one operation. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Webb was the youngest member of the team at 26, a certified rescue diver who had transferred from Station Seattle 8 months prior and still carried the particular confidence of someone who had not yet learned what the deep water could take from a man. Webb was eager in a way that reminded Harrigan of himself at that age, before the accumulated weight of recoveries and body bags had taught him that the ocean did not care about courage or training or good intentions. Webb would learn eventually, as all divers did, that the sea was patient, and the sea was cold, and the sea had been claiming human lives since before humanity had words to describe the drowning. But that lesson would come later. On the night of October 14th, Webb was simply young and capable and unafraid, and Harrigan found himself grateful for that uncomplicated readiness. The patrol boat cut through moderate swells as they made their way north into the strait, the lights of Port Angeles falling away behind them until there was nothing but darkness in every direction, broken only by the pale glow of their running lights reflecting off the black water. The strait was 3 miles wide at this point, with the Canadian shore invisible to the north and the Olympic Peninsula a darker mass against the darkness to the south, and somewhere ahead of them, a submarine was waiting in silence. Oshoa monitored the radio from his station in the wheelhouse, calling out their position at regular intervals on the maritime emergency frequency, receiving only static in response to his repeated attempts to hail the Nereid. The submarine should have been monitoring Channel 16 at minimum, maintaining the constant communication awareness that was standard protocol for any naval vessel operating in civilian waterways. Instead, there was nothing. Not even the automated beacon that would normally broadcast the vessel's identification and position to any receiver within range. Webb checked and rechecked his diving equipment with the nervous energy of someone who sensed that this operation was different from the training exercises that had comprised most of his career thus far. Harrigan stood at the bow of the patrol boat and watched the horizon, waiting for the first glimpse of the surfaced submarine, feeling the cold spray against his face and trying not to think about the message he had received. What he saw first was not the submarine. What he saw first was the absence of light where light should have been. The Nereid should have been visible from 2 nautical miles out, her running lights and emergency beacons creating a bright point against the darkness of the strait, a marker that would warn approaching vessels of her presence. Instead, there was nothing but blackness, a void in the night that his eyes could not penetrate until the patrol boat's spotlight finally caught the submarine's hull at a distance of less than 500 meters. She was running completely dark, every external light extinguished, her metal skin absorbing what illumination reached it and returning nothing. The USS Nereid was a Sturgeon-class research submarine, one of several vessels converted from military service to scientific operations in the decade following the end of the Cold War. She displaced 4,000 tons submerged, measured nearly 300 feet from bow to stern, and carried a crew of 12 specialists conducting research that Harrigan's clearance level did not permit him to know. Tonight, she sat on the surface of the strait like a dead thing, listing 4 degrees to port, her sail tower jutting at an angle that suggested internal flooding or ballast malfunction. and there was no movement visible on her deck or in her conning tower. The only sound was the slap of waves against her hull, a hollow metallic echo that carried across the water like something breathing in the darkness. Ochoa called out to the submarine on the emergency frequency one final time, his voice steady despite the wrongness of what they were approaching. United States Navy vessel Nereid. This is Coast Guard Patrol Boat 4-7-2-8-9er, requesting permission to approach and render assistance. Please respond on this frequency or any frequency you are monitoring. The radio returned only static, and beneath the static, something that might have been interference or might have been something else entirely. A sound like singing, so faint that Harrigan could not be certain he had heard it at all. Harrigan gave the order to bring them alongside, and as the patrol boat maneuvered toward the submarine's deck, his spotlight swept across the hull and revealed something that made him forget about protocols and clearances and every other concern that had occupied his mind. The hull of the Nereid was damaged. Long parallel gouges ran along her port side from the waterline to just below the sail, cutting through the anti-sonar coating and into the steel beneath. The marks were deep enough to catch the spotlight and reflect it back in irregular patterns, and they extended for nearly 50 feet along the submarine's flank. They were too regular to be collision damage, too uniform in their spacing to be the result of any natural phenomenon Harrigan had ever encountered. They curved around the hull in a pattern that suggested something had gripped the submarine with multiple appendages and held on with tremendous force, something with claws. Webb saw them too, and for a moment neither man spoke. The waves slapped against the submarine's hull, and the patrol boat's engine idled in neutral, and somewhere in the darkness, beyond the reach of their spotlight, something moved in the water. Then Harrigan grabbed his dive bag and stepped onto the submarine's deck, his boots ringing against the metal plating, and whatever questions he might have asked disappeared beneath the weight of the mission in front of him. They had a crew to find. The forward hatch was sealed from the inside, the manual release mechanism frozen in a position that should have been impossible given the submarine's design specifications. Harrigan tried the emergency protocols that every Coast Guard diver learned as part of their basic training, the standard overrides that should have opened any hatch on any Navy vessel, regardless of internal conditions. None of them worked. The mechanism had been deliberately disabled, the release handle welded or fused in place by someone who had wanted to ensure that nothing could enter through that particular opening. Harrigan ran his fingers along the seal and felt resistance where there should have been give, and he understood that whoever had done this had been very afraid of something outside the submarine getting in. Webb located a secondary access point near the sail tower, a maintenance hatch used by repair crews when the submarine was in dry dock. The hatch was not designed for emergency entry, and its locking bolts required the use of a portable cutting torch to remove. The metal screamed as it gave way, throwing sparks into the darkness that fell toward the water like dying stars. And when the hatch finally swung open on its hinges, the smell that emerged from the submarine's interior made all three men step back involuntarily. It was not the smell of death, not exactly, though that particular scent was something Harrigan had learned to recognize over 23 years of recovery operations. It was salt, concentrated and heavy, and beneath it the copper tongue of blood. And beneath that something else, something organic and ancient that Harrigan associated with deep water, with the lightless places far below the surface, where sunlight never reached and life took forms that seemed more alien than anything from another world. It was the smell of the abyss, somehow present in a vessel that had surfaced less than a day ago. Webb activated his helmet camera and looked at Harrigan for confirmation, his young face pale in the glow of the flashlight. The senior chief nodded once and began his descent into the submarine, his own camera recording every moment of what would become the most classified footage in United States Coast Guard history. The interior of the Nereid was dark, darker than any submarine should have been even in a complete power failure. Emergency lighting should have activated automatically when main power was lost. battery-powered systems designed to function for 72 hours regardless of external conditions. Instead, the corridors were lit only by the beams of their flashlights, pale circles of illumination that revealed damage Harrigan could not immediately explain. The walls were dented inward in places, buckled as if something had struck them from the inside with tremendous and repeated force. Equipment lockers hung open, their contents scattered across the deck plates in patterns that suggested not an explosion, but a struggle, as if crew members had fought for access to equipment they never reached. And everywhere, on every surface, there was water. Not the slow seepage of a hull breach, not the gradual accumulation of condensation that occurred on all submarines over time, but standing pools and dripping rivulets, as if the entire interior of the vessel had been completely flooded and then drained, leaving behind this residue that should have been impossible at surface pressure. The water smelled of the deep, of the lightless places, of something that had no name in any language Harrigan knew. They moved through the forward corridor, past crew quarters, where bunks had been overturned and personal effects lay scattered in the standing water, photographs and books and small items that had meant something to the sailors who had lived here. Harrigan saw a wedding ring lying in a pool of water beneath an open locker, and he made himself look away, because the ring was evidence, and evidence was someone else's responsibility. They passed a galley where food supplies had been torn open and left to rot, cans split down their seams as if something had simply crushed them to get at the contents inside. They passed a communications room where every radio and computer terminal had been systematically destroyed, screens shattered, wiring pulled from the walls, components scattered across the deck in pieces too small to ever be reassembled. Webb moved ahead of Harrigan now, his light playing across a navigation console that had been attacked with particular violence. The screens were shattered, the metal housing peeled back in strips, the internal components ripped out and thrown aside with obvious contempt. "Senior Chief," Webb said, his voice tight over the communication link in a way that told. Harrigan, the younger man, was beginning to understand what they had walked into. These damage patterns, they don't make sense. This console wasn't damaged by an explosion or a pressure failure. Something tore it apart, something with hands. Harrigan saw what the younger man meant and wished he did not. The marks on the console housing matched the marks on the submarine's hull. Parallel gouges, deep and deliberate, spaced at regular intervals that suggested fingers. Long fingers. Fingers with claws at their tips. And still, they found no crew. The Nereid had carried 12 men and women when she left. Bangor on what her mission log would later describe as a routine research deployment. 12 specialists in fields that Harrigan's clearance did not permit him to know, conducting work that would remain classified long after everyone involved had died. They should have been here at their stations, responding to the emergency that had forced their vessel to the surface. They should have been in the corridors, fighting whatever had invaded their ship. They should have been somewhere, anywhere, leaving behind bodies or survivors or some evidence of their presence. Instead, there was only silence and damage and that pervasive smell of water from places where light had never reached. Oshoa's voice crackled over the radio, distorted by the submarine's hull, but still intelligible, and there was something in his tone that Harrigan had never heard before. "Senior Chief, I'm picking up multiple contacts on sonar. Bearing 045, range approximately 200 meters and closing." There was a pause, and when Ochoa spoke again, his voice had lost its professional calm. "They're circling us, moving in a coordinated pattern. Sir, I've never seen anything like this signature." Harrigan stopped in the corridor and pressed his hand against the nearest bulkhead, feeling through the metal for some vibration that might explain what the surface operator was seeing. He found it almost immediately, a low-frequency pulse running through the hull like a heartbeat, like something massive swimming circles around the stationary submarine. "Identify the contacts," he ordered. "I can't, sir. They're not matching any signature in the database. Too small to be whales, too large to be dolphins or seals, and there are at least a dozen of them. maybe more. The pattern they're swimming, it's like nothing I've ever seen. It's coordinated, deliberate. Sir, I think they're hunting. Webb had stopped at the far end of the corridor, his light fixed on something Harrigan could not yet see. The younger diver's posture had changed, his shoulders rigid, his breathing audible over the communication link. "Senior Chief," Webb said, and his voice was very quiet. "There's someone here. Someone alive." Harrigan moved forward, pushing past Webb, his training overriding every instinct that screamed at him to retreat, to get back to the patrol boat, to report what they had found, and let someone else, anyone else, deal with whatever waited in the darkness ahead. He had a duty to any survivor aboard this vessel. That duty did not end because he was afraid. The forward torpedo room was the largest compartment in this section of the Nereid, designed to house both weapon systems and the specialized research equipment that had been installed when the submarine was converted from military service. Harrigan's light swept across empty torpedo racks that now held instrument packages instead of ordnance, past sealed containers labeled with classification markers he did not recognize, past coils of cable and monitoring devices that had been thrown to the deck as if in a great violence, until finally, in the far corner of the compartment, the beam found what Webb had seen. Chief Petty Officer William Kowalski sat with his back pressed against the cold steel of the torpedo room's aft bulkhead, his legs drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes wide and unblinking in a face that had aged 20 years in a single night. He was 53 years old, a career Navy man with 31 years of service aboard submarines and surface vessels, and his personnel file described him as unflappable, a sailor who weathered emergencies that would have broken lesser men. Now he sat in the darkness and whispered words that Harrigan could not understand, and his right hand clutched a photograph so tightly that blood seeped from where his fingernails had cut into his palm. He did not respond when Harrigan called his name. He did not respond when Webb knelt beside him and began checking his vital signs with hands that shook despite his training. He simply stared at something beyond the bulkhead, beyond the submarine, beyond anything the rescue team could see, and his lips moved in continuous silent recitation of something that might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely. Webb looked up from his examination with an expression that Harrigan had seen before on the faces of paramedics who had found survivors in conditions that defied their training. Pupils are responsive. Pulse is elevated but steady. No visible injuries beyond superficial cuts on his hands. "He's in severe psychological shock, Senior Chief. I've seen trauma before, but this, whatever he witnessed, it broke something inside him." Harrigan crouched in front of the man, trying to meet his eyes, trying to find some spark of recognition in that vacant and terrible stare. "Chief Kowalski," he said, speaking slowly and clearly as if addressing someone very young or very old. "I'm Senior Chief Harrigan, United States Coast Guard. We're here to help you. Can you tell me what happened to your crew?" For a long moment, there was no response but that continuous whispered stream of words that might have been names. Then Kowalski's lips stopped moving, and his eyes focused, just for an instant, on Harrigan's face with an intensity that made the senior chief want to look away. "They came up from below," Kowalski whispered, his voice cracked and raw as if he had been screaming for hours in the darkness, from the deep place. "We went too far down. We found something we weren't supposed to find, and then they came for us." He lifted his right hand, the one clutching the photograph, and pressed it against his chest as if protecting something infinitely precious from a world that would not understand. "They climbed the hull. I heard their hands on the metal, scratching, searching. They found the observation window. And then they started to sing." Harrigan felt the deck plates vibrate beneath his feet, a stronger pulse than before, and through the hull of the submarine, he heard something that made his blood go cold despite the training that should have prepared him for any emergency. It was a sound like singing, high and strange and beautiful, beyond anything human voices could produce, and it was filtering through the metal walls of the submarine as if they offered no barrier at all. The singing was coming from multiple directions at once, surrounding the vessel, growing louder with each passing second. And beneath the beauty, there was hunger. Webb grabbed Harrigan's arm with a grip that would leave bruises, his eyes wide with the sudden certain knowledge that they were in danger beyond anything their training had prepared them for. "Senior Chief, we need to leave. Right now, they're coming back." Harrigan looked at Kowalski, at the photograph clutched against his chest, at the tears that had begun to stream down the man's face without any sound accompanying them. He grabbed the survivor under the arms and hauled him upright, feeling the dead weight of a man who had abandoned any desire to save himself. They would not leave him here. They would not add another name to whatever had happened aboard this vessel. The journey back through the submarine was faster than their initial approach, driven by pure adrenaline and the sound that followed them through every corridor that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the water that still pooled on every surface. The singing was inside Harrigan's head now, a melody that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate somewhere deeper, somewhere ancient that recognized the sound as something older than humanity, older than the species that had evolved to fear the water. It was a call, and part of him wanted to answer it, wanted to find the source and offer himself to whatever made that beautiful, terrible sound. He pushed the feeling down and kept moving. Webb led the way through the darkness, his flashlight cutting wild arcs as he searched for threats in every shadow. Harrigan followed with Kowalski half carried between them, the survivor's legs barely functioning, his whispered words now a continuous stream of fragments that painted a picture Harrigan did not want to see. The glass held for 30 seconds. Kowalski's voice was a monotone recitation of horrors witnessed. They pressed against it, dozens of them, their faces against the window, smiling. The lieutenant, she tried to seal the compartment, but they were already inside. They came through with the water. So fast, so hungry. They reached the maintenance hatch. They had cut open what seemed like hours ago, and Harrigan could see stars above them, could see the deck of the patrol boat where Ochoa was waving frantically for them to hurry, his movements carrying an urgency that transcended normal protocol. But as Harrigan lifted Kowalski toward the opening, as Webb climbed through ahead of them to help pull the survivor to safety, his flashlight swept across the submarine's outer hull one final time. And he saw them. They clung to the metal like pale shadows given form, their bodies pressed against the submarine's flank in positions that should have been impossible, their faces turned upward toward the open hatch with expressions that might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. Harrigan counted 7 of them in the beam of his light before his hand began to shake too badly to hold the flashlight steady. But he knew there were more. He knew that the darkness beyond his vision was filled with their presence, that they surrounded the submarine like wolves around wounded prey, waiting. They were female in form, or something that had once been female in some ancient time before humanity existed, their upper bodies human enough to trigger recognition in some primal part of his brain. But their skin was the gray-white of something that had never known sunlight, stretched over bones that seemed too long, too angular, configured in ways that no human skeleton could support. Their hair floated around their heads in dark tangles that moved with a current only they could feel, wet and clinging like seaweed torn from ancient rocks. And their eyes were black pools that reflected nothing, that seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight and return only darkness. Below the torso, where human legs would have been, their bodies became something else entirely, something that belonged in the deepest trenches of the ocean, where pressure-crushed submarines and light was only a memory. Scaled tails wrapped around the submarine's hull with obvious strength, silver gray and muscular, ending in fins that were ragged and torn like battle standards from some war fought before humanity learned to make fire. One of them, the one closest to the hatch, opened its mouth in a smile that revealed rows of needle teeth, thin and sharp and numerous beyond counting, and the sound that emerged was the singing that had filled the submarine's corridors. It was impossibly beautiful. It was an invitation. It was a promise that the water was warm and the darkness was welcoming, and there was no need to struggle anymore. Webb fired his flare gun. The bright red light erupted across the hull of the submarine, throwing harsh shadows across the creatures' bodies, revealing for one terrible instant the full scope of what surrounded them. There were not 7. There were dozens, clinging to every surface, their black eyes reflecting the flare's light like scattered stars against an infinite darkness. And then they were gone, releasing their grip on the hull and disappearing beneath the surface so quickly that Harrigan might have doubted they were ever there. But the image remained burned into his vision and into the footage from his helmet camera, footage that would be classified within 6 hours of their return to Station Port Angeles, footage that would be officially described as corrupted beyond recovery, the result of electromagnetic interference from the submarine's damaged systems. Footage that Harrigan knew showed the truth. They got Kowalski aboard the patrol boat. They got themselves aboard. Ochoa had the engines at full throttle before Harrigan's boots touched the deck, and the boat was pulling away from the submarine before any of them could speak. Behind them, the Nereid sat dark and silent on the water, a tomb without bodies, and the shapes that circled beneath the surface did not pursue. They had what they wanted. They had let these 3 witnesses go, perhaps to carry the story to a world that would not believe it, perhaps for reasons no human mind could comprehend. The photograph remained in Kowalski's grip throughout the transit back to Port Angeles, clutched against his chest like a talisman against the darkness. He would not release it, would not allow anyone to touch it, and his whispered words had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence that seemed deeper than unconsciousness, deeper than shock, as if some essential part of the man had simply stopped functioning. It was not until they reached the station, until medical personnel had sedated him for transport to the Naval Hospital in Bremerton, that the photograph was finally removed from his hand. Harrigan saw it for only a moment before men in unmarked uniforms who had been waiting at the dock took possession of everything connected to the incident. The image showed the Nereid's forward observation window from the inside, the thick reinforced glass designed to withstand pressures that would crush any unprotected human body. Pressed against that glass, her face filling most of the frame, was one of them. Her features were almost human, beautiful, in the way that a deep-sea predator is beautiful when seen through the safety of aquarium glass, and her black eyes stared through the camera and into whatever soul the photographer possessed. Her mouth was open, revealing those rows of needle teeth, and her hand was pressed flat against the window, webbed fingers with claws that had already begun to scratch shallow grooves in the supposedly impervious surface. She was smiling, and in the darkness behind her, visible only as shapes against a deeper darkness, others waited. The debriefing lasted 4 hours and resulted in nothing. Men with credentials that Harrigan did not recognize and agencies that he had never heard of asked questions that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify, recorded answers that would never appear in any official document, and made it clear through implication and carefully chosen silences that what had happened aboard the Nereid had never happened at all. The official report, the one that would be filed with the Navy and the Coast Guard and whatever other organizations claimed jurisdiction over such incidents, stated that the submarine had experienced a catastrophic equipment failure during a routine training exercise. The crew had been killed instantly when the forward observation compartment breached at depth. Chief Petty Officer William Kowalski had survived by sheltering in the torpedo room, which had remained sealed throughout the incident. The damage to the submarine's hull was consistent with implosion forces at extreme depth. The scratches on the exterior plating were the result of collision with underwater debris during the uncontrolled ascent. The footage from Senior Chief Harrigan's helmet camera had been corrupted by electromagnetic interference from the submarine's damaged electrical systems and contained no usable imagery. The USS Nereid was decommissioned within 30 days and her hull cut apart at a facility in Bremerton under conditions of unusual security. No memorial service was held for her crew. The 11 men and women who had died aboard her were listed as casualties of a training accident, their families given the standard condolences and death benefits, their service records sealed by order of someone whose name never appeared on any document Harrigan was permitted to see. He signed the non-disclosure agreement they put in front of him. Webb signed it. Ochoa signed it. They signed because they understood that refusing would end their careers and possibly their freedom. They signed because they knew that no one would believe them anyway, that the story they had witnessed was too strange, too horrible, too far outside the boundaries of acceptable reality to ever be spoken aloud in a context that mattered. But Harrigan kept a copy of his incident report, the real one, written in the hours after their return, before the men in unmarked uniforms had arrived to take control of the narrative. He kept it in a safe deposit box in a bank in Seattle, along with a single frame captured from his helmet camera before the footage was confiscated, a frame that showed the creatures clinging to the hull of the Nereid in the moment before they vanished beneath the surface. Chief Petty Officer William Kowalski spent 3 months in the psychiatric ward of the Naval Medical Center in Bremerton. The official diagnosis was severe post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative features, the terminology used to describe a mind that had witnessed something it could not process and had simply stopped trying. He was medically retired from the Navy 6 months after the incident, his 31 years of service ending with a disability pension and verbal orders, never put in writing, to never speak of his final mission. Harrigan visited him once, 3 years after the night aboard the Nereid. Kowalski lived alone in a small house outside Olympia, miles from the coast, in a town that did not even have a lake. He had gained weight and lost most of his hair, and his eyes still carried a vacancy that Harrigan recognized from the torpedo room, as if part of him had never left that darkness. They sat on his porch and drank coffee and watched the rain fall on the hills to the east, and for a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, Kowalski set down his cup and turned to Harrigan with an expression that was almost peaceful. "They were always there," he said. "That's what I've come to understand. In the deep places, in the parts of the ocean we haven't mapped, and probably never will. We just finally went deep enough to find them. Or maybe they decided it was time to let us know they existed." He looked out at the rain, at the land that stretched between him and the sea he would never visit again. "The singing," he said, and his voice carried something that might have been longing. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Even now, even knowing what they did to my crew, I can still hear it sometimes. Late at night, when everything is quiet. And part of me wants to follow it. Part of me will always want to follow it." Harrigan asked him about the photograph, about what he had seen through that observation window, about the moment when the scratches on the glass had become cracks, and the cracks had become a breach, and the water had come pouring and carrying them with it. Kowalski was silent for a long time. Then he shook his head slowly and looked at Harrigan with eyes that had seen something no human being was meant to see. "She looked at me through that glass," he said. "Right at me. And I knew, in that moment, that she was older than anything I could imagine. Older than the submarine. Older than the Navy. Older than humanity itself. Older than the fish we evolved from, maybe. We were just visitors in our world, Senior Chief. Trespassers in a place we never should have gone. And she wanted us to know that she was done letting us forget it." Thomas Harrigan retired from the United States Coast Guard 18 months after the Nereid incident. He moved to Arizona, to the desert, to a place where the nearest ocean was 500 miles away, and the only water came from carefully measured sources. He does not know why he kept that photograph, that single frame from his helmet camera. Perhaps he needed proof for himself that what he saw was real. Perhaps he knew that someday someone would ask the right questions about that night. The creatures that clung to the Nereid's hull are the same creatures described by fishermen and sailors across every ocean on this planet. The singing that Kowalski heard, that Harrigan heard, that echoes in the minds of survivors is the same singing described in accounts going back thousands of years. They have been here longer than any nation that claims dominion over the seas. They will be here long after our submarines and our ships have rusted into nothing, and they are watching. If you have seen them, if you have heard their singing, if you have witnessed something that cannot be explained by any science we possess, you are not alone. Share your account in the comments below. Subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.